Welcome to Conditions for Special Parallelograms. Today's objective is to prove that a given quadrilateral is a rectangle, a rhombus, or a square. So when you're given a parallelogram with certain properties, we can use those properties to determine whether the parallelogram is a rectangle. So for our first image here, we have a parallelogram with one right angle. Now, if you were to extend all of these lines, you would see that since this is a 90-degree angle here, that this has to be a 90-degree angle because of the alternate interior angles theorem. Now, if this is 90 degrees, this is a corresponding angle, and that's 90 degrees. And then these would be same side interior, and they have to add up to be 180. So therefore, you have four right angles. So, if a parallelogram has one right angle, then we have a rectangle. Okay, let's look at our second diagram. Now, if we have a parallelogram with diagonals that are congruent, then that parallelogram is a rectangle. So, if we have a parallelogram with diagonals that are congruent, then we have a rectangle. And those are our two conditions for determining whether a parallelogram is a rectangle. The same way that we can determine whether a parallelogram is a rectangle, we can determine whether a parallelogram is a rhombus. Now, in this first image that we have here, we have two consecutive congruent sides. Now, if a parallelogram has two congruent consecutive sides, then that parallelogram is a rhombus. For our second diagram, here we have diagonals that intersect and create a 90-degree angle. So we know that if we have a parallelogram with diagonals that are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So all of these conditions tell us whether the parallelogram that we're given can be a rhombus. Okay, our last diagram here tells us that if one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite sides, then that parallelogram is a rhombus. So if we're given a parallelogram and it has diagonals that bisect opposite angles, then that means that parallelogram is a rhombus. So once again, the purpose of learning these conditions is to prove that a given parallelogram is a rhombus. Now let's use our information on rectangles and rhombus to determine whether we can conclude that this figure here is a square. So, we're given this information and we're trying to conclude is whether figure ABCD is a square. So the first thing that I would do is to mark up the given information on the diagram. So my first piece of information is that segment AB is congruent to CD. Segment AB is congruent to segment CD. The second piece of information is that segment BC is congruent to segment AD. So that means segment BC is congruent to segment AD. It doesn't say that they're congruent to each other yet. It just says that individually both of these segments are congruent to each other. Now the second piece of information is that segment AD is perpendicular to DC. So that means I can draw a right angle right here. And I also know that segment AC is perpendicular to BD. So AC is a diagonal and BD is another diagonal. So I know those two segments are perpendicular to each other right there. So there are many different approaches to this problem, but what I'm going to start off with is trying to figure out whether this quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So that's going to be my first step. Is ABCD a parallelogram? Well, the answer to this is yes. ABCD is a parallelogram because it's a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent opposite sides. So this is a parallelogram. So my next step is to determine, is this a rectangle? Well, we know that ABCD has to be a rectangle because we said that if a parallelogram has one right angle, then it has four right angles, making it a rectangle. So is this a rectangle? Yes, it is. Why? Because if you have a parallelogram with one right angle, then you have a rectangle. Okay, next question. Is this a rhombus? Now the answer to this is yes as well. This is a rhombus because diagonal AC is perpendicular to diagonal BD. So if you have a parallelogram with diagonals that are perpendicular, then you have a rhombus. Okay, let's think about what these three conclusions mean. So if we have a rectangle, that means that all of the angles are right angles. Now if we have a rhombus, that means that all the sides are congruent. So that means that all of these four sides are congruent. So if we have a quadrilateral with the following, with four congruent sides and four right angles, then that means we have a square. So like I said, there are different approaches to doing this, but if you go through this check by check list, you can see clearly that ABCD is a square. Okay, well that's going to be the end of our video for today. Thank you and take care.